Our goal in this video is to pick up where we left off, which is showing a list of map titles in a recycler view. When a user taps on one of the titles in the recycler view, we'd like to navigate to a new screen or a new activity, which will render a map with all of the places in that map shown as a marker. This is where we're going to be talking to the Google Maps API. In order to be able to navigate to a new map activity, the very first step is we need to understand when did an item in the recycler view actually get clicked. The way you would typically do this is by setting a click listener on the item view. And so you can imagine doing something like this, where you say holder.itemView.set on click listener, and then you take some action. So let's actually just try that. So I'm going to define a tag, and the tag will be the name of the class. That's the convention. So now we can say tapped on position. So if I open up logcat and we can see maps adapter, we do see the taps on various positions. What we'd like is main activity to get notified of a tap, and then main activity should be the place where we do the navigation to another screen. So what we'd like is when user taps on an item, we want to navigate to a new activity. So the question then becomes, we're able to listen for clicks right here. We want to notify the main activity when this happens. The way we can make this work is by defining an interface in the map adapter and passing an instance, an implementation of that interface in the maps adapter constructor. And so we'll say interface on click listener. And this is going to have one function called on item click. And it'll take in a position. And now we're going to add this as a parameter onto the constructor. So going back into main activity, we have an error here that we haven't passed in an instance of that interface. So let's do that. And we need to define an implementation for that method. And let's put a log statement here as well. So we're passing in an implementation of an interface, but we're not doing anything with that interface, right? This is unused. So the idea, the way this is all going to tie together is when the item view is clicked on, we want to fire the method on that interface. So we'll say on click listener dot on item click, and we'll pass in the position here. So now every time a user taps on one of the items in the recycler view, we'll call this on item click method, which is part of the interface, and that will then alert this code to be fired, and we'll get this log statement. So let's try it. So now we expect to see two log statements every time we tap on an item. One is from maps adapter, and then one is from main activity. Great, so that works. Once the user taps on an item, we would like to navigate to a new activity. That'll happen inside of the click listener. The way Android does navigation to different screens is through something called an intent system. So if you Google for code path intents, you should be able to come to this guide to talk a bit more about what is an intent and why we should use it. So intents are fundamental to how Android thinks about navigation between different apps and within your app. An intent is a message that can be thought of as a request given to either an activity within your app, an external app, or a built-in service. So an intent is a way for your activity to communicate with the outside Android world. So you can use intents to take the user to another screen within your app, which is what we're going to do, take the user to a particular URL within a web browser, and there's a few other examples given here. There are two types of intents. One is explicit and the other is implicit. We're going to be using explicit intents because those are used to launch other activities within your app. The new screen that we create, which is for rendering a map, that's going to live within our application. That's why we're going to be using explicit intents. Implicit intents are used to ask the Android system to open up any activity that can handle the intent that's described. So for example, you could imagine, I want to make a phone call. I want any phone app to handle that request. Another example could be I want to get a picture. So it doesn't matter where I got the picture from, but I want to fire off an implicit intent to the Android system, and the Android system will return to me any application that can handle that. The way to launch an explicit intent, which is what we're doing, is through something described here. So I'm going to go into the Kotlin tab. We're going to create a new intent object. We pass in a context, which is where we're coming from, and a second parameter of the intent object, which is the class we're navigating to. So we're going to do something very similar in our main activity. So we need to have a class which we navigate to. The way we'll do that is open up project and open up the directory where main activity is located. We're going to create a new activity right here. That's the activity which we're going to navigate to. So go to new and go down to activity and go to gallery, because we're going to actually create a new type of activity that we haven't created before called Google Maps activity. So tap on next and call this display map activity, and then tap on finish. So Android Studio is doing a couple different things for us here, and let me talk you through what exactly it's doing. First off, in the manifest file, every activity that's in your app has to be registered in the manifest. So the first thing that Android Studio did for us is it added this line. So now we have display map activity. The second thing it did is it created a new Kotlin class called display map activity, which is what we're going to fill out. It also created a corresponding layout file called activity display map. All it has is a fragment, and that fragment is a support map fragment, which is what is actually rendering the map. And then finally, there's Google Maps API.xml. So this is where we need to specify a Google Maps API key. So in order to render a Google Map in your Android application, Google needs to make sure that you have the proper permissions to do so. And they also want to make sure that no one is abusing their service, which is the Google Maps service. And so every developer needs to have a Google Maps API key, which you specify here, and that's how Google can make sure that no single developer is taking up too many resources. So by default, there's like a dummy key here, which we'll need to replace in order to get this working. But luckily, this process is really simple. All you need to do is open this link in the browser, and this link has embedded as part of the parameters of the URL exactly the kind of key that we want. So we're going to be fetching this map from an Android app, which is why we have key type client-side Android. And it also has a couple other parameters. For example, here's the package name of our app. And there's also a SHA-1 certificate fingerprint. These are different attributes that Google requires in order to verify the authenticity of whoever is making the request. So I'm just going to open up this URL in the browser. On this page, we need to register our application for the Maps SDK for Android in the Google API console. So either we can take an existing project that we have already, or we can create a new project. I already have an existing project, and I'm going to add the Maps SDK to that one. So I'll say continue, and now it tells us that the API is enabled. So now we can tap on Create API Key, and now we can copy this API key that's generated for us. So copy that and then close it. If you wanted to be more secure, you can restrict the keys that only certain apps and package names can access this key, but that's all we need. So I'm going to copy that to the clipboard, go back into Android Studio, and then paste it in to this file, Google Maps API. Now that we have the display map activity set up, we need to navigate here. So let's go back to main activity, and we'll use the content from that code path guide about creating flows with intents. So I'm going to create a new intent object. And it takes in two parameters, one which is the context, so that's the main activity, and then the second parameter is the class that we're going to. So that will be the display map activity.java, that class. And then to actually do the navigation, you have to call start activity with the intent. So if we try this, if we tap on a item in the recycler view, we should navigate to the new activity. You see that we do navigate to the new activity, but the maps are not rendering. Sometimes what happens is as soon as you create a new API key, it'll take some time for it to actually register and become valid. So one thing I found which will help the process is just uninstall the app from the emulator and then reinstall it. So I'm going to go ahead and uninstall it. And then let's reinstall the app from Android Studio one more time. And now you can see we do see the maps render properly. So let's take a look at the starter code in the new map activity to understand why we're seeing this view. So if you go into display map activity, you can see that we have display map activity and it implements this interface on map ready callback, which is why we have this override on the on map ready function. Basically, we have the corresponding layout file which contains the fragment, which is a support map fragment. We're getting the support map fragment and we're calling get map async and we're passing in the on map ready callback. So basically, this support map fragment is going to do all the magic of rendering the Google Maps API. And when we want to get notified that the maps are ready to be rendered, then it will notify us through this method.
It's worth noting at this point that in order for your Android phone to be using the Google Maps API, it needs to have Google Play Services installed. So as you can see from the comment, if Google Play Services is not installed on the device, the user will be prompted to install it inside the support map fragment. So one of the really nice things about using support map fragment is that it takes care of all the complexity of showing a dialog and an error message to the user if they're on an older version of Play Services or if they don't have Play Services installed at all. This method, the onMapReady method, will only be triggered once the user has installed Google Play Services and returned to the app.
Here you can see that we're capturing the value of the Google Map, which is the parameter here, saving it as a member variable in our class, and then we're adding a marker. So here's a marker for the latitude and longitude of Sydney, Australia, and we're adding it to the map, and then we're moving the camera, which means moving the view of the map to be centered on Sydney. That's why we're able to see this view here. So in order to show the data of the user map, which is the data from the map that was clicked on, we need to actually have access to the user map data inside of this activity. The way we can do that is if we go back to code path, we want to pass data to the launched activity. And so what we want to do is we want to add extra data into the intent in the way that's being shown here. So we'll go into main activity, and as part of the intent, we want to put some extra data. And so typically the way this works is the first parameter will be a string, and the second parameter will be the value that you pass in. So it's a key value, essentially. So the key is always a string, and we'll call this extra user map. And then I'll define that up here. And the reason I'm not making this private is because we actually want to access user map inside of display map activity in order to get the value out. And the value of extra user map will be the user map data that was clicked on. So we'll say user maps at that position. And you'll notice here that Android Studio is complaining. It says that there's no such method which takes in a string followed by a user map, because a user map is something that we've custom defined. The only things that are allowed as the value of a intent data are primitive types such as float, int, short, string, boolean, things like that. Or there's also something else called serializable. The idea of serializable, this is a concept coming from Java, is that you can take an arbitrarily complex data structure. So user map is one example of a data structure because it has different data inside of it, and you can serialize it, which means you can deconstruct it into bytes that you can send back and forth. And then you can later on deserialize it. So you can take those same bytes that represent the user map and actually reconstruct a user map object. And so in order to be able to pass the user map, we need to make the user map data class serializable. So let's open up user map. And it's as simple as extending the serializable interface. And this interface is empty. So actually there's nothing really to do except for extend it. And because we're making user map serializable and the place class is part of user map, we also need to make the place class serializable as well. So now going back to main activity, you can see that the error went away. And in display map activity, we can now retrieve the value of this user map. So I'm going to save the user map as a member variable. I'll say privately init var user map. I'll call it, this is a user map. And we want to get the value of user map from the intent. So we'll say intent.getExtras, get serializable extra, and we pass in the key, which is extra user map, and we want to cast this as a user map. So now that we have user map, let's actually just log something from it inside of onMapReady. Log.I. So just as a proof that this is working, we will just print out the title of the user map inside of the onMapReady callback. And let's define this tag. Okay, let's run it. And now there should be no behavior change other than we should have this log statement being printed out. So I tap on the first element. I again see the map view, the map activity, which is centered on Sydney, Australia. And if I open up Logcat, we should see a log statement from display map activity, and we do. So we have memories from university. So this is proof that we are successfully passing data from this activity into the display map activity. The goal now that we have the user map data in this activity is we would like to be able to add a marker for each place in our map. The way that might work is we say for each place in user map.places, we'd like to do something similar to how we're adding a marker for Sydney. So first we'll define a latitude and longitude, which is based on the position in the map. So I'll say place.latitude and place.longitude. And then we need to add a marker by using marker option. So we pass in the position, which is latitude, longitude. Then we pass in the title. The title will be the title of the place object. And there's also one more field called the snippet, which will be the description of the place. Let's try it. So if I go to January vacation planning, which has locations from all over, you can see that we still have the marker from Sydney. And then we also have the markers which are legitimately part of the map. That looks good. So if we get rid of Sydney now, let's try this one more time. So you can see that we do still see the markers and we got rid of the Sydney marker. However, the map started out by looking at the very center of the equator and it's 0, 0 latitude, longitude. Instead, we'd like for the map to be centered and tightly focused on just the area which contains the markers. And there's a nice way to do this, which is using something called latitude longitude bounds builder. So we're going to say lat long bounds.builder. This is going to be a bounds builder. And the idea is that we want to keep adding latitude, longitude positions into this bounds builder. Include long. And now we can do something similar to what we already have with moving the camera map. Instead of saying new lat long bounds focused on a single latitude, longitude, we want to include the whole bounds. And this is going to be boundsbuilder.build. And there are two versions of this method. One is takes an additional int, which will describe the padding that you want on each of these. And the other version takes in 3 integers, which is the one that we're going to use. I'm going to pass in 1,000, 1,000, and 0. The idea here is that the markers of your map will take up a certain amount of space. If you want to constrain that to be a very small part of the view, you can add in the bounds of that here. By putting in 1,000, 1,000, that's large enough to make it irrelevant. So basically we're saying zoom in as much as possible. We don't want to constrain the amount of space for the bounds in our map. And then 0 means that we don't want any padding. Let's try it now. Great, you can see immediately that the map zoomed into just the area which contains the markers. And if you go into something a bit more precise, like just Singapore, you can see that we are only seeing the Singapore area here. Awesome. One more thing, just in case you're interested in trying it out, there's a lot of nifty methods on the map object that we have here. For example, instead of move camera, I can say animate camera. And this does a really nice animation from the beginning until zooming in until you reach the destination, which contains all the markers. That's something you could try out. I'll go back to the move camera method just because the animation might get a bit tiring if we repeat it too often. One last thing we'll do is update the title of the new activity, the title of the action bar, to be the title of the map. And so as soon as we get the map object, then we can say get the action bar and set the title to be the user map.title. So if we run this now, we tap on one of the entries in the recycler view, we can see that the top of the activity is now updated appropriately to indicate what we're looking at. So we're able now to view a map that we already have, but we'd like to be able to allow the user to create a new map. So that's the goal for the next video. So if you're enjoying this, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.